2024 is a huge year for Polestar, and that's why I've flown all the way out to Spain to sample the latest model in their lineup. This year, they're going to go from one car on sale to 3 cars on sale, and 2 of them are going to be SUVs. This is the latest. It's the all-new Polestar 4. If you want to know about the other one, the Polestar 3, that video is already live on the channel. In this video, we're going to talk about the sleeker, the sexier, and the more affordable SUV entry in the Polestar lineup. Probably the most important thing to know about the Polestar 4 is that this is not a coupified version of the Polestar 3. This rides on a dedicated EV platform, and it was designed from the ground up to be a coupe SUV. Now, whether you want to call it a coupe SUV or a sportback or a liftback sedan, I will leave that up to you. But because of its relationship, it definitely looks a bit different than the Polestar 3 up front. And that's because this rides on a Geely platform also shared with Zeekr. But in North America, this is going to be the only one riding on this same platform. This has the truest expression, perhaps, of the Polestar design language. We don't have the arrow wing that we find in the Polestar 3, and instead of a single headlight module with the same sort of twin blade setup, we get twin headlight modules. Well, actually only one headlight module, because that's down here. Up here we have the turn signal and the DRLs with some accent lights. The other thing you'll notice is that we don't have the safety sensor suite sort of spelled out in front like we find in the Polestar 3. We find that in some Polestar models, but not all of them. Polestar decided that their vehicles should be thematically related, but they didn't need to look like Russian nesting dolls. So we don't have the active safety suite spelled out up front like we find in the Polestar 2 and 3, but we still have the illuminated logo here that we find in other Polestar models. Rather than the entire logo being illuminated, it has more of a halo effect kind of thing going on. Polestar's naming convention is, well, a little unconventional, because instead of the number meaning price tag or size of the vehicle, it simply relates to the order in which they were released. And logically, this came after the Polestar 3. In terms of its size and dimensions, it's actually not far off the Polestar 3. It's about 2 inches shorter overall at 190.5 inches long. But it actually has a longer wheelbase. And that's because this was designed from the ground up to be a coupe SUV, or sedan or hatchback or liftback, whatever you want to call it. With a 118.1 inch wheelbase, this is actually among the longer wheelbase entries in this particular segment. And they did that so that way they could stretch out the rear passenger compartment and then move the roofline back a little bit to give you more room in the back, even though we have more of this coupe-like profile. That's also why we have the other conventional item in the back that we're certainly going to be talking about in just a moment. Now, when it comes to wheels and tires, 255 width tires are where this starts, but we're driving the top end trim today, so we have 265 40R22s. As you'd expect out of a coupe crossover, we have less ground clearance than we find in the Polestar 3. 6.5 inches here versus over 8 inches in the 3. And that's because this is targeting a different competitor. Instead of targeting the future electric Porsche Cayenne, this is targeting the Porsche Macan, the BMW i4X, the Mercedes-Benz EQC, and the Audi Q6 e-tron, although logically you could cross-shop anything you wanted to, from a Tesla Model Y to a Cadillac Lyriq and pretty much everything in between. Because this has more of a sporty mission in mind, we have Pirelli P0 tires here and absolutely massive gold Brembo brakes. Design-wise, I think Polestar absolutely knocked it out of the park. The design of the 4 really gives me some Porsche vibes, not just from the front, but from the back as well, where we find this really big light bar that goes from one side to the other. Of course, this is a European spec model, so we have amber turn signals in the back. I don't know whether those are coming to North America. But one thing we do know that's coming to North America, and is certainly a lot more controversial than the looks as far as the lights go, is this little panel right here. The 4 is by no means the first vehicle in North America to not have a rear window, although most of the others that come to mind are all cargo vans. Here's what's going on. Polestar wanted to shift some of the structure rearward in the vehicle to give the second row more headroom. They also wanted this really sleek appearance and a better view out the back. And the only real way for them to do that was to give us a camera on top and one of those digital rearview mirrors. Because even if this section that looks like it should be glass was glass, it actually wouldn't be a very big view out the back, unless they gave us another glass panel like we found in some Priuses, for instance, down there. I'm not the biggest fan of this design, but I completely understand why they did it. This is certainly the most controversial thing happening, however, on the 4. As you'd expect from Polestar, there is a ton of active driving assistance and active safety tech on this vehicle, but it's not based on the same core architecture as the Polestar 3. Polestar has decided to go kind of in two different directions with these different vehicles. This uses a camera-heavy system, but it still has a radar up front because Polestar thinks that the radar is essential for the proper performance of especially the autonomous emergency braking systems. But it's also backed up by 11 total cameras, including 4 forward-facing cameras. There's one up front there. There are 3 behind the windshield, and 7 of the onboard cameras are 8-megapixel cameras, so they're really high resolution. These are not just going to be used for the active driver assistance and active safety tech, but also future eyes off the road, hands off the wheel driver assistance systems. On the side, we have a bunch of different cameras, 2 here in the side view mirror area, and then 1 right there in the front fender. And those are all looking at the lane lines, blind spot monitoring, and of course, helping keep you centered for everything. I wouldn't be surprised if an even higher performance model was coming at some point in the future, but at the moment this is going to come just 2 ways in North America, either rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. All versions are going to get the same 100 kilowatt-hour battery pack. Of that, 94 are usable. If you get the rear-wheel drive model, that's going to be the least expensive and the most efficient version, but it's also going to be the slowest 0 to 60, 6.9 seconds, thanks to a 272 horsepower motor on the rear axle. The 300 miles of range in that model has not been fully EPA certified yet, so it may adjust up or down by the time those numbers are final. If you want the fastest Polestar ever, you want this one. 544 horsepower, 506 pound-feet of torque, because they add a really powerful electric motor on the front axle. That's going to get this 0 to 60 in 3.7 seconds, but you're going to have to give up about 30 miles of range. They're saying this one should come in right around 270 miles. To improve efficiency in the dual motor model, the front axle features a mechanical disconnect. So rather than simply de-energizing the motor stator, they actually can remove not just the motor, but also the front differential from the equation to help improve efficiency. All models are also going to get a heat pump, which is going to help improve winter range, and all models are going to have an onboard 11 kilowatt AC charger. That's going to take this from 0 to completely full in right around 10 hours or so. If you want to DC fast charge your Polestar 4, that's going to happen in 30 minutes from 10% to 80%, and this should be fully compatible with the Tesla supercharger network once we actually get that factory adapter from Polestar, of course. And that's because this has a 400-volt nominal architecture, so you don't have to worry about the up conversion problems that we see, for instance, in the Genesis GV60 and the GV70. Bearing in mind that I've only spent a day in the 4 so far, I found these front seats to be pretty comfortable. We have a powered tilt telescopic memory-linked steering wheel and a very adjustable driver's seat featuring 4-way adjustable lumbar support. There's also front seat massage and a manual extending thigh cushion. However, I do think that the Polestar 3's seats are actually a little bit more comfortable, just intrinsically in their design. I found these seats to be a little bit more firm. They're certainly a little bit more supportive and sporty, so depending on exactly what you're looking for in your next Polestar, you might want to choose the one over the other. Thanks to the long wheelbase, there is a ton of legroom in the 4. Now, when you look at the numbers on the side of your screen, you may notice that at just under 79 inches of combined legroom, there are a number of options that are theoretically on paper bigger. But with this front seat adjusted for me very comfortably at 6 feet tall, and actually a little bit more reclined than I would normally sit due to the lower roof line here, I have a massive amount of legroom left. I'm not exactly clear what's going on with those numbers. I think that it's just maybe Polestar being conservative when it comes to the legroom measurement figures. Moving here to the middle, I have a reasonable amount of headroom. My head is not touching the glass, but if I move all the way over here to this side, maybe it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. If I lean back in this seat, my head is now touching not the glass, but actually this fabric area right behind the seats. Now, these rear seats are powered, so I can pull this down and actually put this seat in more of an upright position. Honestly, I find the upright position a bit more comfortable, and in this position, my head is entirely under the glass. So now I have about an inch of headroom left. Exactly how you feel about the rear seats is really going to be determined by how reclined you like to sit in the rear. And for me, I tend to prefer being in a little bit more of an upright position. Although I have to admit, I am surprised that they didn't find some way of carving out a little bit more headroom from the roofline. Here's a close-up look at the center armrest. We find those power seat controls right there, cup holders that pop out of the armrest, and here we have a color touchscreen for some infotainment options, as well as the rear climate control, including heated seats, and you can also power control the seat there if you don't want to fold down this center armrest. So say, for instance, there's a child seat or someone sitting in the middle, you can control it through that display. Here's a better look at the rear seat headroom situation. So you can see in this upright position, the headrest is really quite above that glass, but in its more reclined position, you can see that it really goes over this fabric portion of the roofline. Since we don't have a rear window, we have this little panel here, but you can actually drop it down. It's actually a little bit easier from the cargo area. You can pull it out and then have access to the cargo area or put some of those larger cargo items inside. When it comes to cargo capacity and cargo practicality, the Polestar 4 is logically going to be behind some of the boxier entries, not just because of the really sloping hatch, but because the entire roofline of the vehicle really drops down quite a bit. And that means that a 22-inch roller bag like this can't really be in this position and still have the hatch closed. But there's a trick that this has up its sleeve. I can actually lower the cargo floor down one notch, and then you actually could put some of those bags across the back. And that's thanks to this being a dedicated EV platform. Keep in mind that the cargo area is not going to be quite as Home Depot practical as some of the larger options, but I think they actually did a pretty reasonable job with this. We also have the ability to remove this little divider right here, and then you can put those longer items right inside. I know a lot of you are asking, what about a front trunk? That is one of the most common questions we get about an EV here. We do have one, although it's more of a front cubby or a frubby, I guess you could say. There's enough room in here for 2 high visibility vests, your charge cable, maybe a Tesla tap, but that's just about it. And that's of course because we have that standard heat pump system in the vehicle and a relatively low front end. You can see it's just above my knee as far as the front end height. We also don't have a hood that is quite as long as some EVs. So it is definitely on the longer side. It's not quite as short as something like a GV60, but it's certainly not as long as some. Let's take a quick look around the interior now. You can see the rear view camera going on right there. I have the hatch open at the moment, but you can still see out the back with that rear view camera. That's our intrepid videographer and editor there, Alexandra. We also have an electrochromatic optional roof. This one does not have that particular option, so this is just a plain sheet of glass here. I think I would get that option because it is going to reduce the solar load inside. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger and fixed in place headrests. Remember that the Polestar 3 and the 4 are not directly related, so they don't share that much when it comes to the interior parts, including the general seat design. Some of the themes, however, are carried over, like the yellow seat belts there, of course, and some of the patterns that we find in the leather upholstery. Leather is available in the Polestar 4. This is animal welfare certified leather, but if you don't want any animal in your car, you can get a number of other interior fabric options. You can see we have the extending thigh cushion right there for the driver and the front passenger, and lots of premium and soft touch materials around the interior. I really appreciate the fact that they've integrated the speaker grills into the fabric inserts up front, whether we're talking about the ones further up there on the dashboard or the ones in the doors, etc. It really gives this interior a really clean look. Lots of soft touch materials like the lower portion of the dashboard, the upper portion of the dash, and then that fabric insert right there in the middle. Moving over to the very center of the dashboard, we have something different than we find in the 2 or the 3, which is a horizontal format display. It still supports smartphone integration, which is something I know a lot of folks are really going to love, but of course it also has the native Google mapping interface, and this display is pretty snappy. In addition to the full screen mapping interface, you can also drag the bar around and get a collapsed view for some of the widgets right like that. This system has a ton of options, lots of apps that can be installed, web browsers, streaming media, etc. They really paid attention to the usability and the layout of this system and really fast changes. So you'll see that as you move around the system, even with a dry finger, all these changes are pretty snappy. If you want to know more about this infotainment system, there's going to be a complete video on the channel that you can check out as well. Now, one thing to note, of course, is that all the climate control settings are done right here in the climate control infotainment system as well, including adjusting the air vents. That's something that we haven't seen from Polestar until now. Not exactly my preference, but it does give the dash a really clean look. Now, below that, we find single big air vent. It actually has 2 outlets, one for the driver and one for the front passenger. Big Qi wireless charging mat right there. Keep in mind, you can't really be seeing your phone while it's in that slot because it goes into the dashboard. Big play, pause, and volume knob for the infotainment system. Roller cover for the 2 cup holders. Then a reasonably sized center console storage area. That's where we find the USB input and a USB charge only port. The Apple CarPlay integration is wireless in this vehicle. And then because we have a relatively flat floor in here, there's also a big storage area right there under that center console. Moving over to the driver's side, we have a full color LCD instrument cluster and a full color heads-up display up there as well. So if you're interested in an EV that doesn't just have a big center screen, you might want to check out this. We also have a moving map display and certainly greater feature functionality in this LCD infotainment and instrument cluster software than we found in the Polestar 2. The Polestar 2's display sometimes comes across as a little bit basic. This definitely has a bit more going on. Moving out from there, we find part of the driver attention system here, so you can see those little IR LEDs right there. There's also a camera over there on that side. At the moment, the Polestar 4 does not support hands-free or eyes-off-the-road driving, but that is all coming a little bit later via some software and some hardware updates as well. We have big hand grips up there at the top of the steering wheel, nicely flat bottom, and a combination of touch and physical buttons for things like the adaptive cruise control over here, and on this side, infotainment controls as well. You'll notice that we don't have any light-up buttons on the steering wheel itself. Instead, they show you what's going to happen via that instrument cluster display right there. But when you click in, the entire button module actually clicks down. All right, everybody, let's get the Polestar 4 out on the road. Now, bear in mind, we are in Europe where there are lots of speed cameras, so we're definitely not going to be doing any speeding. And I think we're just going to take Polestar at face value that this will go 0 to 60 in 3.7 seconds. For the final official 0 to 60 score, you are going to have to wait until I get one of these back at home. Although I will say, I would not be surprised if this was quicker than 3.7 seconds because Polestar has, interestingly, been one of those brands that seems to underrate their vehicles. And in the Polestar 2, we consistently got quicker 0 to 60 times than they had been claiming. Would not be at all surprised if that was the case for this Polestar 4. Now, the big thing to know about the 4 is that, yet again, this feels very different than the 3. And that's because it has a very different suspension. The two vehicles are not related at all, and instead of the adaptive air suspension that is standard in the 3, we get a regular steel spring suspension in the 4 with an available adaptive setup. So the adaptive dampers are optional, but they're always going to have steel springs behind them. Unfortunately, I have not been able to sample the least expensive Polestar 4. That's going to have the single motor in the back, so it's still going to have a strong rear power dynamic, but it's not going to have the adaptive dampers. So I don't know whether it's going to feel like this vehicle when it's in the standard mode, or in the nimble mode, or in the firm mode. I do have to say though, firm mode is pretty darn firm, and definitely very different than the feel that we get in the Polestar 3. That has a much softer, much more comfortable ride. But the firmer suspension feel goes with the character of the Polestar 4, especially if I pop this in the performance mode, where acceleration is very, very peppy, pretty much at any speed. Whether we're going 0 to 60 or we're talking about passing power, this has an awful lot of both. Now, if it's in the range mode and you're just cruising around the highway and you want to go make a passing maneuver, you should know it will take a little bit longer than if it was in the other modes, and that's because of the mechanical front axle disconnect. This doesn't use an electromagnet front motor where they can just, disable one of the coils and have greater efficiency. In this vehicle, it has a permanent magnet motor up front, and they physically disconnect the differential and the front electric motor. Polestar says that the combination will reconnect because of traction, because of aggressive regenerative braking, depending on how you're driving, etc. So there are a lot of conditions that can reconnect the front axle. You don't have to worry about it not coming to boil depending on what you're doing, like you do see in some of the competition, most notably some of the Genesis, Hyundai, and Kia models. In those vehicles, if you're in the eco mode, the front motor just does not do anything really. In this, it's definitely a different story. It's just that it may take a little bit of time for the front motor to join the party. The other thing we definitely noticed out here in Spain is that the Polestar 4 is very quiet, both in terms of wind noise and road noise. This is more hushed than honestly I had expected it to be. Remember that this is the performance-focused Polestar and the less expensive alternative versus the 3. So I'd honestly expected this to be a little bit louder out on the road. It certainly feels more civilized than the last Model Y or the last Model 3 that we've driven, including the updated Highland Model 3, which was still a little bit louder than I may have preferred. Now, speaking of Tesla, clearly the Model Y is going to be considered a direct competitor to this by many people. Polestar thinks that this is trying to target a different customer, but let's be honest, a lot of folks are going to cross-shop a Model Y. So let's talk about how they differ in terms of their drive. This has a firm suspension feel, but it doesn't feel firm and bouncy like the Model Y can sometimes feel. It seems to be that there's just a little bit more suspension travel, a little bit more ability for the suspension to damp the motions of the chassis. That's definitely a good thing. We of course also get the instrument cluster where you'd expect it to be, and the heads-up display where you expect it to be as well. So in some ways we have a lot of the same formula, a lot of the same things that make a Tesla going on in here, with some of those more traditional car-like touches. But you're still going to adjust the mirrors and the steering wheel and things like that with the buttons on the steering wheel and the infotainment systems. There's still some of the quirkiness going on in a Tesla, wrapped inside a slightly more normal package, I would say. Driving nature, honestly, there's not an enormous difference between the two in terms of where the power is going out on the road and how they're going to feel at their core. The Model Y is definitely a rear-wheel drive based vehicle. Even though you can get a dual motor model, it's always going to send most of the power to the rear axle, just like the Polestar 4 here. The two companies definitely have different strategies when it comes to tackling efficiency. In the Model Y, we have a front motor disconnect that's electric in nature. So basically they just de-energize one of the coils on the motor and then it has less loss. In this, they not only remove the motor from the equation, they also remove the front differential from the equation. But this does not have the trick torque vectoring rear axle that we find in the Polestar 3. So if you want to take things to the next level and have that ability to torque vector the rear and really give you extra yaw, then you want that particular Polestar model. Polestar also has a different philosophy versus Tesla when it comes to regenerative braking. This has a blended braking system on board, so it offers a little bit more control over the throttle liftoff regen. Remember that no current Tesla has what every other manufacturer calls blended braking. Tesla has a feature they call blended braking, but it's not what I'm referring to here. In this vehicle, I'm just coasting out here because I have the one pedal drive completely off. But if I put my foot on the brake pedal, then we actually get regenerative braking back into the battery. And we can get even more power into the battery than you'll find in a Model Y or a Model 3. This has very aggressive regen. But I would say that the one pedal drive is not quite as smooth as what we find in the Model Y. It comes across a little bit smoother than I had expected in the low mode. In standard mode, it's not quite as aggressive, and sometimes the engagement feels a little bit less natural than we find in the Tesla. Other thing I should mention is that if it's in the off mode, which is actually my preference as far as EVs and driving, then the brake pedal feels grabby sometimes, because when you first start pressing the brake pedal, it's of course going to initiate regenerative braking. Now this is an early pre-production model. They have let us know that not all of the software is production intent, so they may still be tweaking and refining some of the features like regenerative braking. They have also said that some of the infotainment system that you've seen is not production final either. So there are going to be some changes over time. We will have to see if this is one of those changes at home. I'm not personally bothered by the initial grab in the regenerative braking pedal, but it is something it's going to take a while to get used to. And if you're used to something like a Model Y, this brake pedal is not going to feel quite the same, because in the Model Y, you press on the brake pedal, all you get is friction braking. It has a very natural, very linear feel, and that's exactly why Tesla went in that direction. Here, it's just a little bit different. The last thing we should probably talk about is the rear view camera setup here. I would really just love a rear window, even if it was a tiny one. I noticed that when filming this vehicle and trying to rearrange it for the right shot earlier, that it's actually pretty difficult to back up in a straight line, just relying on the cameras, this camera, that camera down there. I would have preferred a window in the back. I could have just leaned over, looked back behind me, backed up like I traditionally do. That also will take some getting used to, but I think even after getting used to it, it's not going to be quite the same as an actual window in the back and a real mirror setup. Minor complaint. If you don't do a lot of backing up, or you're really the kind of person that just relies on your camera all the time, it's probably not going to be a huge deal. And again, there are lots of other vehicles in North America without a rear window, but as I said before, most of those are still going to be cargo vans, so it's not exactly a Polestar 4 corollary. Bottom line, the Polestar 4 is definitely a fun car to drive. It's also an interesting blend of, I would say, traditional car company meets Tesla, meets electrification, all blended into one and then poured into a Polestar 4 shaped vehicle. I'm also intrigued by the fact that Polestar has chosen to give us not a bigger and a smaller SUV per se, but two SUVs that have very different personalities playing in almost the same segment with a whole lot of price overlap between the two. The Polestar 3 is going to be more expensive than this, but there's a reasonable amount of overlap, especially if you're looking for the higher performance options like the Polestar 4 that I'm driving right here. Very different personalities, however, based on, the kind of thing that you're looking for. But the two vehicles have very different personalities. If you want to have the EV that's, I would say, more traditionally fun, you want the Polestar 4. If you want the more relaxed, bigger feeling EV, even though it's about the same size, you probably want the Polestar 3. Now to the nitty-gritty. How much is the 4 going to set you back? Well, the rear-wheel drive model with 300 miles of range and a ton of standard equipment starts at $54,900 plus destination. If you want all-wheel drive, that's going to be $62,900, but remember, that's going to be the fastest Polestar ever made. 3.7 seconds is definitely very, very swift. If you get carried away with options like this particular model, it's going to be $82,450. Well, actually I should say not exactly like this one because there are a few options that this one does not have. It does not have the electrochromatic glass roof, which is definitely an option that I would get, that effectively can dim the glass roof without having a shade on it, and it doesn't have the optional body-colored components. You can get this either with or without some of the body-colored trim bits. It looks a little bit more SUV-like in this form. There are still going to be some black components around, but a lot of the upper level components actually turn body color. So if you want something a little bit sleeker, a little bit more sedan-like, you want to take a look at that. If you want a little bit more of an SUV vibe, you should take a look at this. And if you want even more of an SUV vibe, you want to take a look at the Polestar 3. It's more conventionally shaped with a bit more of a vertical hatch in the back. Also, it has the black fender flares and over 8 inches of ground clearance. Now, how does this stack up in the segment? Well, honestly, it's a bit difficult to say at the moment because not all of the competition is currently on sale. And the key competitors coming soon are going to be the Macan EV that's actually available to buy some places in the world. We haven't driven it here yet on Auto Buyer's Guide. The BMW i4X is also coming out really soon. And I think those are probably going to be the two closest competitors to this. Remember that the Polestar 4 is all about styling. But I suppose you could also compare this against something like a BMW i4 because it certainly gives sportback, liftback, sedan-like vibes. And for Polestar to call this an SUV, you know, I think they could have also called the Polestar 2 an SUV because it has kind of similar proportions and kind of similar ground clearance as well. Handling is definitely fantastic in the 4, as is acceleration, and has a really practical interior. Also, another reason to buy this over the 3 is that it has that horizontal landscape sort of layout for the infotainment screen, and I think the software is just a little bit better done in the 4 than in the 3, but you now have another option in this segment. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. If my money were on the line, especially if I were taking a look at a top-end trim of the Polestar 4, I would probably buy the Polestar 3. I think it's a little bit more comfortable inside, a bit more conventional. Of course, it's going to have a rear window exactly where you expect it to be. But if you're totally okay with the rear view camera concept, then you'll probably be just fine with this one. If you're looking to save a bit of cash, of course, and you want just a really high performance SUV in this segment for not a lot of cash, that's going to be the $62,900 base all-wheel drive model. Keep in mind, of course, this will not get the federal tax credit. And that's the last thing we probably should talk about because I know this is going to be all over in the comment section. Yes, this is currently built in China. That is going to change about 6 months after production starts. So if you don't want a Chinese-built Polestar 4, just wait a little bit. It's actually going to be built in South Korea for a number of world markets. Initially, production will happen in China. It's going to continue in China for Chinese market purchases, but it's actually going to move to South Korea for North America and other markets out there. The Polestar 3, that's a different animal because that's actually going to go on sale in America, also being built in China, but production's actually going to move to South Carolina shortly thereafter. So if you want an American-made Polestar, that's going to be the 3. If you want a South Korean Polestar, that's going to be the 4 eventually. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And would you cross-shop this against a Macan EV? I have to say that, you know, there's not as much customization going on here versus the Macan, but I think the outside looks fantastic. The Macan does feel more premium inside. I have been able to sit in it, but keep that price tag in mind. It is going to be significantly more expensive. I'll see all of you later.